The courtroom fell silent as the judge slammed the gavel down. The sound echoed through the air, the finality of it heavy and cold. At that moment, nothing seemed real. A young man stood at the center, his eyes locked on the judge, his chest tight with the weight of the decision. His hands, trembling slightly, gripped the wooden rail in front of him, as if holding on to the last remnants of a world he knew. 19-year-old Ethan Walker had never thought this day would come. He had never imagined that his life would be defined by a moment like this. Yet, here he was, his entire future suddenly erased in the blink of an eye. Sentenced to life in prison for the brutal murder of Samuel Hayes, the judge had said, his voice as cold as the verdict. The words echoed in Ethan's head, but they didn't make sense. Ethan had never even met Samuel Hayes. He was just a teenager from a quiet town in Ohio, struggling to find his place in the world. But now, in a cruel twist of fate, he was being labeled a murderer. His whole life, his dreams, his future, they all seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. As the gavel fell, sealing his fate, the courtroom remained still, the air thick with tension. The prosecutor, a stern-faced man who had spent years building this case against Ethan, stood tall, his chest puffed with pride. The defense attorney, a tired, overworked man with a resigned look in his eyes, stood by helplessly. Ethan's family, his mother, his younger sister, sat in the back of the room, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a drum of doom. Life in prison. It felt like a death sentence. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but one question stood out among the chaos: how had this happened? He had always been an average kid, never involved in trouble, never someone anyone would expect to be accused of a crime so brutal. The evidence had been flimsy at best, but somehow, the jury had bought it. A few misplaced pieces of evidence. A mistaken identity. And now, he was being sentenced to life. His mind raced back to the events that had led to this moment. The night of the murder was a blur, but he remembered the key details. He had been home. He'd been watching TV, playing video games in the safety of his own living room, while the world outside continued to spin. He had never seen Samuel Hayes before that night, and yet here he was, accused of killing him. Ethan's world had never felt so small. So trapped. As the judge continued to speak, his words fading into a blur, Ethan's attention shifted. He was vaguely aware of the judge's final remarks, something about parole and eligibility after 25 years, but his mind had already checked out. He was already lost in the abyss of his new reality. He didn't know how long he stood there, but the weight of his future pressed down on him. The judge's words continued to ring in his ears, and with each passing second, the walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on him. His legs felt weak, his chest tight with the overwhelming pressure of it all. Then, as the noise in the room began to swell with whispers and murmurs, Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. "Son, it's over," the defense attorney said quietly. "We'll appeal. I'll make sure of it." But Ethan didn't hear him. He was too lost in his own thoughts, too consumed by the horror of what was happening. His eyes darted to his family. His mother, sitting in the back row, had tears streaming down her face. She looked like she had aged a decade in the span of an hour. His younger sister, Emily, sat beside her, her eyes wide with fear, unable to understand the weight of the situation. In the midst of it all, Ethan's heart seemed to crack. The injustice, the confusion, it was all too much. And then, just as the guards began to move toward him to escort him out of the courtroom, Ethan felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. Without thinking, without truly considering the consequences, he pushed his way past the officers, stepping back toward the railing. His voice, shaky but determined, rose above the noise. "Wait. Please. I didn't do it," he cried. His words echoed through the room, the desperation in his voice cutting through the tension. The judge's eyes flicked toward him, a brief moment of surprise crossing his face before the stern expression returned. "Mr. Walker, you've been sentenced. It's time to move on." But Ethan didn't care. He couldn't care. His life had just been taken from him, and he wasn't going to stand by quietly while the world turned its back on him. His hands, still trembling, reached for his pocket. He pulled out his phone and, with shaking fingers, dialed the one number he knew could help, his father's number. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. And then, finally, his father answered. "Hello," came a calm, authoritative voice. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Dad," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Dad, it's me. I need your help, now." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if his father would hang up. But then, his father's voice came through the speaker, more urgent now. "What's going on, son? Are you okay?" Ethan could barely speak. His emotions were a whirlwind, the flood of confusion and despair making it hard to put into words the enormity of what was happening. I'm in trouble. I've been sentenced to life in prison. They think I killed someone, but I didn't do it, Dad. I swear to you, I didn't do it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Ethan could hear the sound of his father's breath, steady and calm, but Ethan knew that beneath the surface, his father was reeling from the shock. "You're telling me you didn't kill him?" His father's voice was laced with disbelief, but there was something else too, something like a spark of hope. "I didn't, Dad. I swear I didn't. But they're sending me away. Life in prison, no parole. I don't know what to do." His father's voice was firm now, no longer filled with uncertainty. "Listen to me, Ethan. We're going to get you out of this. I don't care what it takes, I'll do everything I can to help you. You're not alone in this. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." Ethan's heart lifted slightly at his father's words. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. His father, the U.S. Attorney General, had power. He had influence. But was that enough to overturn a life sentence? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted as the officers moved toward him, their hands on his arms, guiding him toward the door. The courtroom was starting to empty, but the whispers of the crowd still hung in the air. The eyes of the spectators seemed to burn into his back as he was led out, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He could hear his father's words ringing in his ears, "I'll do everything I can to help you." As the door to the courtroom swung open, Ethan stepped into the harsh, fluorescent-lit hallway. The noise of the crowd, the reporters, and the camera flashes outside felt like they were miles away. But the weight of what had just happened, the life sentence, the injustice, the fear, was all too real. One thing was certain now, his fight was only beginning. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed in the sterile hallway as Ethan was led through the dark corridors of the courthouse. His thoughts raced, a chaotic storm of confusion, anger, and disbelief. His heart pounded in his chest, and the sound seemed deafening in the silence around him. Every step felt like he was walking further into an abyss, the world he once knew fading with every turn. The officers at his sides didn't say a word. They just guided him, like he was nothing more than a criminal to be processed, an item to be moved along. Ethan's mind replayed his father's words over and over again, but they felt distant now, almost unreal. Could his father really help him? Could the most powerful man in the country, his father, the U.S. Attorney General, really undo a life sentence for a crime he didn't commit? "Get it together," Ethan muttered under his breath, trying to push aside the panic rising in his chest. "You're not done. You can't give up. Not yet." They stopped in front of a thick metal door, and one of the officers knocked twice before unlocking it with a harsh, metallic sound. Inside, Ethan was led to a small holding cell. The walls were cold, the floor concrete, and the air was thick with the scent of desperation. It was a far cry from the warm, comfortable home he had once known. The officer shoved him inside without a word and slammed the door behind him. Ethan stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of a bench. He stared at the bars, the cold steel feeling like a permanent sentence, not just for his body but for his spirit. A part of him wanted to collapse onto the floor and surrender to the overwhelming weight of it all. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when his father was out there, promising to fix everything. For the next few hours, the time dragged on unbearably slow. The world outside felt distant, and Ethan's mind ran in circles. What was going to happen? His trial was over, and now he was just waiting. Waiting for what? An appeal? A miracle? What kind of justice could he expect after everything that had happened? His stomach churned with anxiety, and his fingers drummed against the cold steel of the bars. The uncertainty gnawed at him. The one thing that had always kept him going was the idea that he could escape his small town, build a future, maybe even make something of himself. But now, everything had crumbled. His dreams felt like shattered glass beneath his feet. The harsh sound of the door unlocking broke the stillness. Ethan's head snapped toward the noise, and a figure entered the room. It was his father. Richard Walker stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders framed by the dim light from the hallway. His face was as stern and composed as ever, but Ethan could see the worry lines etched deep into his father's face. The man who had always seemed invincible, untouchable, was now standing in front of his son, his expression tight with frustration. Richard had always been the embodiment of control, but now there was a trace of vulnerability in his eyes. "Dad," Ethan whispered, a flood of emotions crashing over him. It was the first time he had seen his father up close since the trial, and despite the tough exterior, Ethan could see the fear in his eyes. Richard stepped into the cell, the door swinging shut behind him with a heavy thud. He didn't sit down, just paced back and forth for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Finally, he stopped in front of Ethan, his eyes locked on his son's. This is a nightmare, son. I don't know what's worse, the fact that you're here or the fact that I can't figure out how they've gotten away with this." Richard's voice was thick with emotion, something rare for the man who was usually the epitome of stoic professionalism. "I've already started working on the appeal. You don't need to worry about that." Ethan swallowed hard. "But what if the appeal doesn't work? What if they don't listen, Dad?" Richard's jaw tightened, and he knelt down to Ethan's level, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. "It will work. I'm going to make it work. They'll have to listen to me. I'll tear this case apart piece by piece. I don't care how long it takes." Ethan wanted to believe him. He needed to believe him. His father had always been the person he turned to in times of trouble, the man who had every answer, who could fix everything. But now, for the first time, Ethan wondered if even his father could fix something this broken. Richard stood up, pacing again, rubbing his temples. "I've read through everything. The evidence they've used against you is flimsy at best. But something doesn't add up, Ethan. There's something we're missing here. I just don't know what it is yet." Ethan stared at him, the knot in his stomach tightening. "What do you mean? What do you think happened?" Richard stopped pacing and turned to look at his son, his eyes narrowing. "I think we've been played. Someone has framed you, Ethan. I don't know who, but I'm going to find out. The question is, why?" Ethan's mind raced. A frame job? Who would want to pin a murder on him? It didn't make sense. He had no enemies, no reason to hurt anyone. He was just an average kid, trying to get through life without attracting too much attention. But here he was, standing accused of a brutal crime, his future hanging by a thread. "Why?" Ethan echoed. "But how? How could they do this?" Richard's gaze softened. "We'll figure that out. I'll make sure of it." They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation settling in the air between them. Ethan wanted to reach out and believe in his father's promise. But something gnawed at him. A feeling deep in his gut that told him there was more to this story than he knew. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice firm. "I'm going to make some calls. I've already contacted a private investigator. He'll be here in a few days to start looking into everything. In the meantime, I need you to stay strong. Don't lose hope." Ethan nodded, but doubt lingered in his mind. Could this really work? Could his father, one of the most powerful men in the country, really break through the system and save him from this nightmare? As his father left the cell, Ethan was left with nothing but the cold, hard walls around him and the overwhelming sense of uncertainty that refused to leave him. His future felt like a dark tunnel with no light at the end. Hours passed, and the uncertainty only grew. Ethan spent his time pacing, his mind constantly circling back to the same question: who could have framed him, and why? Every time he thought about it, the feeling in his gut grew stronger. There was something he was missing. Something important. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, but they didn't fit together. The next few days dragged on in a haze. Every time the guards came to check on him, Ethan was reminded that the world had moved on without him. His life, as he knew it, was over. And yet, his father's words echoed in his mind. He wasn't alone in this. His father would make it right. But no matter how hard he tried to believe it, a part of him couldn't shake the growing doubt. He had been sentenced to life in prison. And no matter what his father did, no matter how many calls he made, no matter how many people he brought in, could he really undo something so final? Could anyone? The phone call with his father had given him a glimpse of hope, but hope, it seemed, was the most dangerous thing of all. Because as long as there was hope, there was always the risk of it shattering. And Ethan was terrified that it might. Ethan hadn't slept in days. It wasn't the uncomfortable cot in his cell, or the cold, unforgiving walls that kept him awake. It was the gnawing feeling in his stomach, the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The walls of the cell seemed to close in around him, but his mind was focused elsewhere. The doubt, the confusion, nothing made sense. Every time he tried to connect the dots, the pieces slipped through his fingers. His father had promised him hope, but hope felt like a distant memory now. His world had been shattered, and there was no clear path to put it back together. The trial was over. The sentence had been passed. And now, Ethan was nothing more than a prisoner, caught in a system that had failed him. Yet, despite all the chaos, there was a small part of Ethan that clung to the promise his father had made: "I'll find out who did this to you. I'll make sure the truth comes out." Richard Walker's words echoed in Ethan's mind, but they felt hollow, distant. His father was doing what he could, but was it enough? Could even the U.S. Attorney General get to the bottom of this? Could anyone? The sound of the door to his cell opening broke his train of thought. Ethan looked up to see a guard standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Walker," the guard said in a tone that was more an order than a request. "You've got a visitor." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Visitors were rare, especially in a place like this. His mother had visited him a few times, her face pale and worried, but it had been days since she had come. She didn't have the strength to keep coming back. His father had promised he would be here soon, but that hadn't happened yet. "Who is it?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse from days of silence. The guard didn't answer directly. "Follow me," he said, stepping aside to let Ethan out of the cell. With a nervous jolt, Ethan stood up. He felt the weight of his own body, heavy from the constant tension. As he walked down the long, sterile hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoed around him. The world outside this prison felt like a distant memory. The guard led him into a small, dimly lit room. A table sat in the center, with two chairs facing each other. At the far end of the room sat a man, his back to the door, his profile sharp against the faint light from above. Ethan's heart tightened. Something about the man's posture, his quiet demeanor, sent an uneasy ripple through him. The guard stepped back, closing the door behind him, leaving Ethan alone with the stranger." Ethan hesitated for a moment before slowly walking toward the man. The stranger didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his arrival. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of the situation. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know who to trust anymore. The man's head slowly turned, his face coming into the light. He was older than Ethan expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples. His eyes were sharp, calculating, too calculating for Ethan's comfort. "My name is Daniel Cross," the man said in a deep, gravelly voice. "I'm a private investigator. Your father hired me." Ethan's pulse quickened. His father had mentioned hiring someone, but he hadn't said who. He had assumed it was a lawyer, or someone who could handle the appeal. But a private investigator? That was something else entirely. "Wait, you're here to help me?" Ethan asked, his voice rising with a mix of hope and confusion. "But how can you? I've already been convicted. I've been sentenced." Cross didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Ethan for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I'm here to look at the case from a different angle," he said slowly. "To find the truth that's been buried. Your father didn't give up on you, Ethan. He believes you didn't do this, and so do I." The words hit Ethan like a wave. For a moment, it felt as if the ground beneath him shifted, like he had just been given a glimpse of a way out of the nightmare. But the doubt crept back in, just as quickly. How could anyone believe him? The evidence was all pointing toward him. The trial was over. And no matter what his father or this man believed, Ethan was still trapped in a cell, his future hanging by a thread. "Why me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would anyone go this far to frame me? I'm nobody." Cross's eyes softened, though his expression remained stoic. "That's exactly why," he said quietly. "You're nobody. At least, that's how they see you. Someone they can throw away. Someone they can use as a pawn in a much bigger game." Ethan frowned. "A pawn? What game are you talking about?" Cross leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "A game that goes far beyond what you could imagine, Ethan. I've been doing this long enough to know when something doesn't add up. And your case, it doesn't add up." Ethan's head spun. His mind was full of questions, but there was one that stood out above the rest. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, leaning in slightly, trying to piece together the fragments of the conversation. Cross took a deep breath, then spoke in a low, measured tone. "The evidence against you, the physical evidence, the timeline, the eyewitness accounts, everything points toward you. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, something's off. It doesn't fit. There's someone behind this, pulling the strings. Someone who's been very careful to keep their tracks covered." Ethan's heart raced. "Who?" Cross hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "That's what I'm here to find out. Your father hired me because he doesn't believe you're guilty, and neither do I. We're going to uncover the truth, Ethan. And when we do, we'll clear your name." Ethan felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone was finally on his side, someone who was going to investigate this case. But terror because, for the first time, the realization struck him that this wasn't just about him. This was bigger. Much bigger. "I don't understand," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would someone want to frame me?" Cross's gaze hardened. "Because you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And someone has a lot to gain by making sure you're out of the picture." Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of Cross's words. Who would want to target him? What did they have to gain? Cross stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "I'm going to start looking into this immediately. I have some connections in law enforcement and the legal world who can help. But I need you to do one thing for me, Ethan: stay calm. Don't make any rash moves. If you get too aggressive, it could make things worse. Ethan nodded slowly, though his mind was still spinning. What happens now? Cross looked down at him, his expression unreadable. Now we wait. We wait for the pieces to fall into place. And when they do, we'll expose the truth. But don't get your hopes up too soon. This could take time. As Cross turned to leave, Ethan was left in the quiet room, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on his shoulders. The world outside felt more distant than ever. But for the first time in days, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was out there. And maybe, just maybe, he could find his way out of this nightmare. The weeks that followed were a blur of uncertainty. Ethan's world had become a waiting game, a silent battle against time and a justice system that seemed bent on ignoring the truth. Every day felt like a repetition of the one before, his life confined to a tiny cell where the only thing that changed was the slow trickle of news from the outside world. Daniel Cross had kept his word. The private investigator, though not present every day, had been busy. Every few days, he would visit Ethan, updating him on his progress, revealing new pieces of the puzzle. At first, it felt like progress was being made, but each new revelation only led to more questions. Ethan was no longer sure what was real. He had spent years living a normal life, attending school, playing sports, dreaming of a future outside his small town. Now, every step forward seemed to push him further into a labyrinth of lies and deception. The man he had once believed in most, his father, was out there, fighting for him, but Ethan was beginning to wonder if even the Attorney General could unravel this mess. It had been 5 weeks since that fateful day in the courtroom. 5 weeks since the life sentence had been handed down, and 5 weeks since Ethan's father had promised him that he would find the truth. But nothing had changed. At least, not in any way that Ethan could see. It was late in the afternoon when the door to his cell opened again. Ethan had grown used to the routine of the guards coming and going, but this time, the figure that stepped into the room was unexpected. It was Cross. Ethan's heart skipped. The last time they'd spoken, the investigator had seemed confident. Now, however, his face was drawn, his eyes tired and shadowed by the weight of whatever he had uncovered. "Got something for me?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with both hope and exhaustion. Cross didn't immediately answer. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat down across from Ethan, his eyes scanning the room as though checking for eavesdroppers, though they were alone. He placed a thick manila folder on the table between them, its contents hidden behind a clasp. "I wish I had better news for you, Ethan," Cross said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "But we've uncovered something. Something you need to hear." Ethan leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What is it? What did you find?" Cross opened the folder and slid a few papers across the table. Ethan picked them up carefully, scanning the contents. They were printouts of surveillance footage. At first glance, they didn't seem to tell him anything he hadn't already seen, clips from the night of the murder, showing him in the vicinity of the crime scene. But there was something off about the footage. "This was taken the night of the murder," Cross said. "The police had this, but they didn't release it to the public. They didn't want anyone questioning the timeline." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, questioning the timeline? What's wrong with it?" Cross leaned back, watching Ethan's reaction closely. "Watch carefully," he instructed. "The time stamp on the video is off. And not just by a few minutes. It's hours. And when you look closely at the footage, you can see something else, a figure in the background." Ethan squinted at the screen. At first, he couldn't make out much. The footage was grainy, typical of surveillance video. But as he focused, something shifted in his mind. There, just in the corner of the frame, was a shadowy figure moving in the background. Someone, no, something, was there, lingering near the scene. Ethan's heart began to pound. He wasn't sure what he was looking at, but the unease growing in his chest was undeniable. "Who is that?" Ethan whispered, almost to himself. Cross leaned forward, his expression grim. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Someone went to great lengths to tamper with the evidence. Whoever this person is, they're not supposed to be there. And their presence isn't just a coincidence." Ethan's mind raced. A figure in the background? Someone who shouldn't be there? It didn't make sense. He had been convicted based on evidence that pointed directly to him, but this new piece of the puzzle, shifted everything. But how does this change things? Ethan asked, though he could already sense the answer. How do we prove this wasn't just some random person? What if it's just a mistake? Cross let out a slow breath, clearly trying to temper Ethan's growing panic. "I don't think it's a mistake. The police missed it, or worse, they ignored it. But the real question is, why? Why would they overlook someone at the crime scene? And why was this footage never made public?" The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture was still unclear. Someone had clearly gone to great lengths to frame Ethan. But who? And more importantly, why had the authorities refused to acknowledge this new piece of evidence? "I don't know what's going on anymore," Ethan said, rubbing his temples. "If they're hiding things like this, what else are they covering up?" Cross stared at him for a moment before speaking, his voice thick with resolve. "The truth, Ethan. And I'm going to make sure it sees the light of day." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind buzzing with the implications of what Cross had just said. The system was broken, that much was clear. But could they really take it down? Could they expose the truth when it was so deeply hidden? Days turned into weeks, and Cross kept Ethan updated on the progress of his investigation. Each new lead only deepened the mystery. The more Cross uncovered, the more it became clear that Ethan wasn't just a victim of a wrongful conviction, he was a pawn in a much bigger game, one involving powerful people with a lot to lose. As the investigation dragged on, Ethan's hope began to waver. Every new revelation seemed to raise more questions than answers. Who were these people behind the scenes, pulling the strings? What did they stand to gain by framing him? And why had they gone to such extreme lengths? One evening, as Ethan sat in his cell, staring at the small television mounted on the wall, he received an unexpected visitor. The door to his cell opened, and in walked a man he had never seen before. The man was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, and his face was impassive, as though he had come to deliver bad news. Ethan stood up, feeling a sudden wave of dread wash over him. "Who are you?" he asked. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder as though making sure they were alone. Then, he looked Ethan in the eyes, and in that moment, Ethan could feel the weight of the words that were about to come. "My name is Agent Thomas," the man said finally. "FBI. We need to talk." Ethan's stomach dropped. "The FBI? About what?" Agent Thomas stepped closer, his voice low. "We've been looking into your case. And I have reason to believe that you're not the only one being framed." Ethan's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "The people behind your conviction," Thomas continued, his eyes narrowing. "They're part of something much larger. Something we've been investigating for a while now." Ethan's mind reeled. Larger? The last thing he wanted was to be caught up in something bigger than he could handle. "We have reason to believe your case is linked to a series of other wrongful convictions," Agent Thomas said. "But it goes deeper than that. It involves corruption. High-level corruption." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Corruption. High-level corruption. The FBI? What was going on? "I need you to help us," Thomas said, stepping closer. "We believe you've been caught in the crossfire of something much bigger. And if we're going to expose it, we need your help." The cold air in Ethan's cell felt heavier than it had before. It pressed against his chest, suffocating him with a weight he couldn't explain. Days had passed since Agent Thomas's visit, but the words still echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing moment. Corruption. High-level corruption. How had it come to this? How had Ethan, just an ordinary teenager, become entangled in something so vast, so far beyond his control? He had thought his life was over the moment the gavel came down in the courtroom. He had believed his future was sealed. But now, nothing felt certain anymore. Not the justice system. Not his family. And certainly not the people who had once promised him safety. The man in the suit, the FBI agent, had left him with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, the forces behind Ethan's wrongful conviction weren't just trying to silence him. They were trying to cover up something much bigger. Something that could shatter everything. He hadn't told anyone about the meeting with Agent Thomas. Cross had been his only source of comfort in this tangled mess, and he trusted the investigator more than anyone else. But Cross hadn't been able to give him any answers either. He had said that the FBI was involved now, but that didn't make Ethan feel safer. It only made things feel more dangerous. That night, as Ethan lay awake, his mind racing, the door to his cell opened again. It was Cross. The private investigator's face was as grim as it had ever been, and Ethan could see the weight of the world in his eyes. Cross had been avoiding him lately, keeping his visits brief and his updates cryptic. But tonight, he had come prepared to talk. Ethan sat up as Cross entered. There was something about the man's posture that made Ethan feel uneasy. Cross was always calm, always collected, but tonight, he looked worn out, his usually sharp eyes clouded with doubt. "You look terrible," Ethan said, trying to lighten the mood, though his own heart was racing. Cross didn't smile. "I've been up all night," he said, taking a seat on the small chair across from Ethan. "We've uncovered something important, but it's not good news." Ethan leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What did you find?" Cross sighed and opened a folder, sliding it across the table. "Take a look at this." Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the papers. The first was a printout of a government document, official-looking, with seals and signatures, though some of the text was redacted. Ethan scanned the page quickly, trying to make sense of the complex legal jargon. "What is this?" he asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. "It's a list," Cross replied. "A list of people involved in a covert operation, one that goes back years. And it's tied to your case." Ethan's eyes widened. "Covert operation? What kind of operation?" Cross hesitated before answering. "One that involves manipulation of the legal system. One that involves people in high places using their power to control outcomes, to make sure certain people go to prison while others walk free. And I'm sorry to say, Ethan, it looks like you were a target." Ethan's stomach lurched. He had been framed, but not by just anyone, by a network of people who had the power to manipulate the entire system. He could barely comprehend the implications of what Cross was telling him. "But why me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did I do to deserve this?" Cross looked him in the eye, his face full of sympathy. "You didn't do anything, Ethan. That's the point. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone wanted to make sure you took the fall for something they'd been covering up. You were a scapegoat. Someone needed to silence you. And they knew you wouldn't be able to fight back." Ethan stared at him, the weight of Cross's words sinking in. "Who are these people? Who's behind this?" Cross shook his head. "I don't know yet. But I have a theory." He paused, giving Ethan a moment to absorb the information. The silence between them felt heavy, oppressive, as if the air itself was thick with secrets. "They want to protect something," Cross said, his voice low. "Something they've been hiding for years. And you've been caught in the middle of it." Ethan felt like he was falling into a hole, and no matter how hard he tried to climb out, the walls kept getting higher. The more he learned, the deeper the hole seemed to go. Every answer Cross gave only raised more questions, until it felt like there was no way out. "I don't understand," Ethan said, shaking his head. "I was just a kid. I had no idea what was going on. Why couldn't they just let me go?" "They couldn't," Cross replied. "Because you were a threat. A loose end." Ethan felt like the ground beneath him was slipping away, and he had no idea how to hold on. "A loose end?" Cross nodded. "You're not just a victim of a crime. You're part of something much bigger. And if we don't figure out who's behind this, it's not just your life that's at risk." Ethan felt the weight of the words sink into his bones. He had thought his fight was just about clearing his name, but it was more than that. His life was no longer just in jeopardy, it was a pawn in a much larger, much more dangerous game. Cross leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "We're running out of time. Whoever's behind this is getting desperate. They don't want the truth to come out." "Why?" Ethan asked. "What are they trying to hide?" Cross didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed a new piece of paper across the table, a photo, this time. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but Ethan could make out the outlines of a building. It looked like an office complex, something official. "What's this?" Ethan asked, staring at the photo. "Take a look at the people in the photo," Cross said. "The man in the suit standing by the door, he's someone important. Someone connected to all this. I've been following him for weeks now. His name is Jonathan Klein. He's a businessman, but I've found connections to law enforcement and even people in government. He's been pulling strings from behind the scenes." Ethan stared at the photo, his heart pounding. "So this guy, he's the one who set me up?" Cross nodded slowly. "Not just you. He's been involved in a lot of cases. Yours is just the most recent." Ethan's mind was racing. He was getting closer to understanding what had happened to him, but the pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, too far apart to make a complete picture. Klein had orchestrated his fall, but why? What was his motive? And more importantly, how far did this web stretch? "I need to talk to him," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I need to confront him." Cross held up a hand. "It's not that simple, Ethan. Klein is dangerous. He won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect his secrets." Ethan didn't care. He couldn't sit by while his life was torn apart by people he didn't even know. "If he's behind this, then I have to face him. I have to make him pay." Cross's expression softened, but there was no denying the urgency in his eyes. "We're going to get him. But we need to be smart about this. We can't rush in blindly. We have to gather evidence, expose his connections, and bring him down piece by piece." Ethan sat back, his thoughts a jumbled mess. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to wait any longer. His life had been stolen from him, and now it was time to take it back. The door to the cell opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The familiar guards. Another visit, no doubt. But Ethan's mind was already far ahead. There was a fight ahead, and he wasn't going to lose. Not again. The days had blurred together in a haze of urgency. Ethan had never felt time slip away so quickly, but now, every minute mattered. The clock was ticking, and he could feel the walls closing in around him, just as they had when he first stepped into this prison. But this time, it wasn't just about his freedom, it was about justice. It was about taking back control of his life, and exposing the corrupt system that had torn him apart. Agent Thomas had kept his promise. The FBI had been working in the shadows, collecting evidence, building their case against the men who had orchestrated Ethan's downfall. But the more Ethan learned, the more he realized just how deep the conspiracy went. This wasn't just about one man or one set of lies, it was about an entire network of powerful individuals who had been manipulating the system for years. At the center of it all was Jonathan Klein. The businessman with the carefully cultivated image, the one who had always seemed untouchable, had finally shown his true colors. Klein wasn't just a wealthy entrepreneur, he was the mastermind behind a much larger operation. His connections to law enforcement, government officials, and influential figures ran deep, and it became clear that he was willing to do anything to protect his empire. Even if it meant destroying innocent lives. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about him. The photo Cross had shown him of Klein standing outside the office building had haunted him ever since. It was the face of a man who thought he was untouchable. A man who had no idea that someone, somewhere, was beginning to unravel his secrets. And now, that someone was Ethan. He had always believed that justice was a simple thing, that good people were rewarded, and bad people were punished. But now, he saw the world for what it really was, a complicated, messy place where the lines between right and wrong weren't always clear. Where power and influence could bend the rules, and where the innocent were sacrificed to protect the guilty. But Ethan wasn't going to be sacrificed anymore. The door to his cell opened, and Agent Thomas walked in, his face as calm as ever. But Ethan could see the tension in his eyes. The weight of everything that had been uncovered was wearing on him, too. "We're getting close, Ethan," Thomas said, his voice steady. "We've tracked Klein's movements. We know where he's been. But there's still one thing we're missing, something that could prove his involvement in your case." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. "What's missing?" "We know it was him. We know he set me up. Why isn't that enough?" Thomas shook his head. "It's not that simple. We need something concrete, something that ties him directly to the crime. Without that, we can't go public. We can't expose him the way he deserves to be exposed." Ethan clenched his fists, the urgency in his chest growing. "Then we need to find it. Now." Thomas looked at him, then nodded. "I've already arranged for you to meet with Cross. He's been working on something that might help us. We need to act quickly, Ethan. Klein's starting to get nervous. If we don't move fast, he'll destroy everything." The word sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He had no intention of letting Klein win. Not again. Cross arrived later that day, his face etched with exhaustion. He had been working tirelessly, gathering information, tracking down leads, and piecing together the puzzle. But Ethan could see that even Cross was beginning to feel the strain. This was no longer just about clearing his name, it was about bringing down an entire system of corruption. "We're close," Cross said, his voice low and urgent. "I've got a contact inside Klein's organization. Someone who's willing to talk. They say they have proof that Klein was behind your framing. But getting to that proof won't be easy. Klein's not going to let this go without a fight." Ethan nodded. "I'm not afraid of a fight. I've been fighting my whole life." Cross looked at him, his expression hardening. "This isn't like anything you've faced before. Klein has resources. He has people who will do anything to protect him. If we go after him, we're putting everything at risk." "I don't care," Ethan said, his voice firm. "He took everything from me. And now it's time to take it back." Cross didn't argue. He knew there was no stopping Ethan now. The stakes had never been higher. They made their plans in secret, working in the shadows to gather what they needed. The contact inside Klein's organization, a former employee who had grown disillusioned with the corruption, had agreed to meet them in a secluded location. It was risky, but it was their only chance. The night of the meeting, Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. This was it, the moment when everything would change. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but he couldn't back down now. He had come too far. As they approached the meeting spot, a small, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Ethan could feel the tension in the air. It was quiet, too quiet. They parked the car and crept toward the entrance, the only sound the crunch of gravel under their feet. Inside, they found their contact waiting for them, an unassuming man in his late 40s, wearing a plain jacket and glasses. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to follow him at any moment. "I don't have much time," the man said, his voice shaking. "But I've got what you need. Proof. Hard evidence that Klein was behind it all." He pulled a folder from his bag and handed it to Cross. Ethan watched as the investigator flipped through the papers inside, photos, documents, and emails that painted a damning picture of Klein's involvement. The web of lies and corruption that had been spun around Ethan was now exposed in black and white. "This is it," Cross said, his voice tense. "This is the proof we needed." Ethan's heart raced as he glanced at the documents. His name was everywhere, on the pages of contracts, in emails between Klein and his associates, hidden in plain sight. It was all there. Klein's fingerprints were all over the case, and now they had the evidence to prove it. But just as Ethan began to feel a rush of triumph, a sharp noise echoed from the entrance of the warehouse. The sound of footsteps. Someone was here. "Get down," Cross hissed, pulling Ethan behind a stack of crates. They crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. The footsteps grew louder, and then the door to the warehouse creaked open. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as a figure stepped into the dim light. It was Jonathan Klein. Klein's face was a mask of calm confidence, but Ethan could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. He knew they were onto him. He knew they had the evidence. "You've come this far," Klein said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "But it won't matter. You can't stop what's already been set in motion." Cross stood, his hand on the gun holstered at his side. "We have the proof, Klein. It's over. You're going to pay for what you did." Klein smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you've won? You think exposing me will change anything? You're just pawns in a game you don't understand." Ethan felt the surge of adrenaline again, but this time, it was different. He was standing face to face with the man who had destroyed his life, and now, he had the power to expose him. The feeling of control was intoxicating. "You're finished," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And we're going to make sure everyone knows what you did." Klein's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "You don't know who you're dealing with. You've already lost." But as he turned to leave, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. It was the FBI. It was over. Klein's empire was crumbling, and there was no way out for him now. As Klein was taken away by the agents, Ethan felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed. His name would be cleared. The truth would come out. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan could breathe.